questions here, and then I open it up to you so that we can have a really great level with our audience today. At the center of our debate are the rise of income inequalities and its impact. Why are income inequalities at the highest level in history? Where do we go from here? Will income inequalities increase further, stabilize, or decrease? How much income inequalities can our society sustain without any upheaval or even violence? Is globalization, which ultimately led to the current situation, doomed? And what comes next? All these questions we're going to try to answer, which brings me to our all-star panel this afternoon. And let me introduce Uri Darush, a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco, James Galbraith, professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and Jomo Sundaram, professor at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia, and advisor to the Malaysian government. Sorry guys for shortening your more than 30 years, and there's no end in sight. Even the gap between the top 1% and the top 20% is huge. So the question is, how does this end?
How does this end? I thought you were going to ask why it happened first. You kind of take me to the end. Well, just a word, and I know that Professor Galbraith will say more. Just quickly the reasons. You said 3 minutes, right? Yeah. So just the reasons, 4 reasons for it happening, and it leads to the answer, what happens in the end. The 4 main reasons are technical change, which is favoring skills and uniqueness and penalizing all labor-intensive activities or labor that is, relatively unskilled. That's the most important. The second, which is also significant in itself and because it affects technical change, is integration into the global economy, especially through trade with low-income countries. To some degree, although to a minimal degree, migration plays a role too in affecting the wages of the unskilled. That's a secondary thing. The third is the Piketty argument, which is that capital is even more unequally distributed than income, and the return to capital is higher than the growth rate of the economy. And so there's a tendency, and the rate of return to capital has been quite high during the era of globalization. So that's the third reason. And the fourth reason is a failure to redistribute, in fact, a movement away from redistributive policies. Now, when you look to the future, there's a question right now, which is the subject of this conference, about what happens to globalization, and also to some degree, what will happen to the return on capital, because if we have less globalization, we're probably going to get a lower rate of return to capital. But technological change is continuing, and will probably continue to make things worse. It's not an absolute certainty, because some aspect of the new technologies may replace skilled workers. But I think overall, this is the underlying trend, that technology will make it worse. And as far as redistribution policies, well, as everybody reading the papers knows, the We'll come back to that, but I just don't want people to think that the whole world is characterized by the evolution of the United States.
All right, well, that's some uplifting thought. Professor Galbraith, you're heading the University of Texas Inequality Project, measuring and comparing inequality between groups, regions, and countries. Same question, how did we come to where we are, which is at historically the highest levels of inequality, despite all the progress that has been made, lifting people up out of poverty, better health care, et cetera, et cetera.
So you mentioned the work of the University of Texas Inequality Project, which is going on now for 20, 25 years, and has, I think, developed an effective way to make measures and therefore comparisons across countries. And what we find is that the movement of inequality within countries, as a general matter around the world, was driven by the changing policies and the changing financial regimes that developed beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So the debt crisis that affected Latin America and much of the rest of the world drove up inequality in those regions. The collapse of the socialist bloc at the end of the 1980s drove up inequality in that part of the world, and there was followed by liberalizations in India and China and elsewhere in Asia, which culminated in the financial crisis of 1997. In 2000, actually, there's a peak. And after that, the rise of inequality is actually, it's not reversed, but it's substantially stabilized. So this is a period of, let's say, neoliberal globalization and financialization, which is principally, clearly responsible for the rise of inequality in most of the world. And I want to come back to the question of the advanced countries, of the United States being a leading example. We've also done a great deal of work on this very rich data environment. And what we find is that the rise of income inequality in the United States is overwhelmingly driven by the capital markets. It's the same phenomenon, essentially. Small numbers of people getting very large increases in their income because they have control of assets whose prices are going up very radically. And so this is why in the 1990s you see extreme concentrations of income on the West Coast, San Francisco, the Silicon Valley area, King County, Seattle, Washington, as well as in New York. And it's extraordinary how concentrated that income is, which also tells you that the phenomenon is much less important in the rest of the country. So I beg to differ on 3 of your 4 points. I think capital is maybe 90% of the explanation for the rise of inequality as measured in the United States. In the rest of the world, you don't have that. It's what we're measuring basically is labor incomes, but we're looking at the effect of let's say, of globalization, differentiating very small numbers in the advanced sectors from very large numbers in the lagging sectors. And that just is a common pattern that you observe just about everywhere that countries are exposed to the global financial system. Countries that have insulated themselves from it, and this is China in particular, but also we're going to look at Iran and some other cases, have a different story. But that's also, again, tells you that the story, the primary story, is the one I've just described.
Let me just add a follow-up question here before we go to Asia and Malaysia. For the first time on record, the 400 wealthiest Americans last year paid a lower total tax rate, spending federal, state, and local taxes than any other income group. The overall tax rate for the richest 400 households, so we're not talking about a huge amount of people, last year was 23%, down from 70% in 1950 and 47 in 1980. The question is there a structural a political problem here that I mean, tax rates are established by government, right?
There's clearly a problem, and it's not unique to the United States, and the problem is oligarchy, where you have small numbers of people who can, for example, influence the tax policies affecting these very high levels of income, and that's not unusual. What is unusual in the United States is that we have good data on it. And that is something which one cannot say for Europe or for many other places where you don't have effective tax collecting authorities. In the U.S., people report their income, so at least we know who these people are. We often know them by name, and we can track their influence through the political system, which doesn't make the thing any less painful to observe, but does give the observer a certain advantage.
And also, just quickly, the United States, it's very expensive to run elections in the United States.
Can you speak into the microphone clearly? 'Cause I can't
Sorry. It's very expensive to run elections in the United States. And I think money plays a role in politics everywhere, but I think it's particularly important in the United States, in part because of the cost of elections and the legislative structure that they have with respect to campaign finance.
All right. So, Dr. Sundaram, you have worked a lot on income inequality in Malaysia. What is your Asian perspective, so to speak, on the points that we've raised so far?
I think it's, I really can't speak from an Asian perspective or a Malaysian perspective. Much of the work I've done has been global and some on East Asia. But I think what the evidence seems to suggest is that it doesn't, what we see in East Asia and also in Northern Europe suggests that the income distributional outcomes which we see in much of the world does not have to be the case. Especially in Northeast Asia, we find that the Gini coefficients for income at least have been relatively lower, and the same thing can be said of Northern Europe. The other difference, of course, is that the tax systems, particularly in Northern Europe, have been progressively redistributive. I happen to agree with Professor Galbraith's review of the world situation, but I would like to add two things. I think what we have seen in the recent period, in the last 3 decades or so, has been a phenomenon where finance, not in the old sense of banks and so on and so forth, but in the new sense, finance is now very, very influential in terms of claiming a share of, for want of a better term, value added. So you have a lot of value subtracted through successful capture of rents, which have been facilitated by this relationship between politics and the economic system. So we find, for example, that the World Bank has been actively promoting for all multilateral banks and governments to essentially guarantee profits, returns, so as to encourage the private sector to invest in things which are ostensibly going to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. This is all very nebulous, but I think we find a great deal of innovation in terms of finding new ways of further rent extraction by finance in particular, but also by others. For example, many of those who dominate what is referred to as the digital economy have also been very innovative in this regard. Another very important finding which has become important recently is that much of the return to a relatively new form of a stronger property right, which is associated with intellectual property, suggests that there is absolutely no basis to the claim that you need to have these high rates of return to intellectual property in order to motivate technical innovation, scientific innovation, and technological innovation. This is being demonstrated by work in all kinds of fields, not just in economics, in evolutionary biology, and so on and so forth. And so I think this is very important because we have a very peculiar situation where the U.S. Attorney General was unable to take a young man who had bought over the rights to a particular drug, and he had raised the price 60-fold. Okay, from $13.50 to $750, and in doing so, Loretta Lynch, who was the Attorney General, was unable to sue him, to take him to court. So eventually, she got him for running a Ponzi scheme. But basically, in a sense, demonstrating the inability for U.S. There is no law against price gouging in this particular instance. Let me give you another instance. You take there is a very common condition in many tropical countries called hepatitis C. And hepatitis in about 2% of the Malaysian population, for example, suffers from hepatitis C. Now, the cure, the treatment for hepatitis C, the patented treatment costs the equivalent costs almost $70,000 US dollars. The generic treatment, which you can buy from Bangladeshi companies, from Indian companies, and from Egyptian companies, costs somewhere in the region of about $300. Okay, just to consider the difference, 70,000 versus 300. So we have new ways of capturing rents, which have very little to do with the purported reasons for doing so. And all this, I think, the new types of property rights, the claims on CDOs and so on and so forth, CDSs, all this were very important in causing the last crisis. But despite all the efforts at reform, we do not see any attempt to try to mitigate that. And this is particularly difficult because the rules of finance are largely written at the national level. There are no rules and no enforcement of rules at the international level. The Bank of International Settlements has no rule enforcement capacity. The International Monetary Fund has no rule enforcement capacity. So we have a situation now in the world where claims to financial rents and intellectual property rights, all these are new forms of property rights which contribute to what Yuri Dadush referred to as the Piketty phenomenon. These are not natural, these are artificial constructs which can be reversed, and we have to begin to recognize them and begin to try to address them. The last point, I think, which I would emphasize is that at least the work of Branko Milanovic seems to suggest that there has been some reduction of international inequality and income inequality, while in most economies in the world, not all, we have seen an actual increase in income inequality in the last 3 decades or so. And as he also mentioned, the reduction in global inequality has been largely due to a few countries in Asia, not just East Asia, but also South Asia, accelerating their growth rates. But in all those economies, it is important to emphasize national level inequalities have actually grown sometimes to preposterous levels.
Yeah. It's interesting, even a country like Germany, and we were speaking about the 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, even in Germany, the income inequality gap between the West and the East has actually become bigger. And that is quite remarkable.
You mean recently, right? You
don't over the past,
yeah.
Yeah, because at the beginning, I mean, the East Germans, right, and everyone was thinking that, over time the gap would be closed, but that's not the case. There are a recent study out that should suggest it has, despite Germany's prosperity over the past 10 years, the inequality gap has actually become stronger. So the question now is very simple. What can governments do? What is the remedy? Is fiscal policy a tool, or is it as preferred because of the globalization of finance? Is it impossible that we move ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So really there are two dimensions, well, three dimensions to government policies. The third one is less important. The first dimension to government policy, which as an economist I like a lot, is the actions that reduce inequality in the long run by improving if you like, investing in the human potential of people, okay? And these are improving not just the quantity, but the quality and the distribution of education across the nation. You have huge disparities in the quality of education. Hamza Saoudi, who's sitting there, my research assistant, and I just wrote a paper on Morocco, on inequality in Morocco, where we underscored that the utilization of human potential, the underutilization, is a vital part of inequality in Morocco, and what the Moroccan government can do to reduce it is to improve the distribution of education and also to get women to participate more in the labor force. That's another growth enhancing and inequality reducing strategy. And the same applies to investment in health, which is very, very important. Investment in preschool education is very important, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one angle. The second angle, which is always more complicated, is the redistribution. And in some countries, there is a lot of room for redistribution. I believe that's the case of the United States today. You just mentioned some astonishing statistics. There's a lot more that you can do in the United States. Redistribution, probably less of an opportunity in France today or in Germany, where already you have a very powerfully redistributing state apparatus, and you can actually measure it, albeit very, very approximately. The US state, the United States is doing very little redistribution today, net. So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect is, which is the less important, I think, is the international cooperation. So if you believe, as Professor Galbraith believes, and Mr. Sundaram believes, if you believe that you know, financialization is tremendously important, then the whole issue of tax havens, et cetera, plays an important role in this inequality. It's not necessarily measured, by the way, in the statistics, but there's obviously a tremendous amount of capital in the world today that is largely escaping the tax net. And that cannot be handled by just one country acting in isolation. It needs coordination. I would say those are the three things, but the thing that I would most underline, based on the work that I've done in different areas, is that reducing inequality is not necessarily something that will come at the cost of economic growth, or even in some instances at the cost of the government budget. There's a lot that you can do to improve inequality and grow the economy, and also perhaps even improve the government budget, at least over the long run.
Professor Galbraith, your thoughts on this issue?
Give me a précis of the question. I must say the sound is not carrying over.
Oh, okay.
It would be better if you spoke directly into the microphone.
Okay. Your thoughts on the role of fiscal policy. Can fiscal policy be an instrument here to help reduce or at least stop the
You mean government spending?
government spending? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So fiscal policy is a tool for economic stabilization. I wouldn't use that term to describe the institutions of a social welfare state. And those institutions were built up in the 20th century in all of the advanced so-called capitalist states in order to make them viable to recover from the Depression, from the collapse of the prior basically unregulated capitalism, and to make them sustainable and competitive in the face of the challenge from the socialist bloc. Now, institutions have been eroded since the end of the Cold War, but they still exist. And in the United States, and again begging somewhat to differ from my colleague, there is in fact a very substantial social welfare system. There is a very strong system of Social Security. 2/3 of the American elderly take it when they're 62. There is a universal health care for the elderly. There's a federal health care program for the poor. There are substantial other programs. The reason it's not universal is that in the period of American industrial dominance, the unions preferred to have employer-financed health care because it was a stronger program. We're obviously running into major difficulties with that now, but even so, we spend twice as much on a higher GDP base for healthcare than any other advanced country. Maybe not efficiently. Too many people, pharmaceutical companies and so forth, get inordinately wealthy on the spoils of that system. But that there is a vast system there is not to be denied by anybody, it seems to me. And there are many other programs one could talk about: unemployment insurance, food stamps, and on and on. So those institutions, which are the foundations of a mixed economy and the core of the public sector in an economy that's otherwise features the major element of private business enterprise, are there to stabilize the economic activity overall, which they have accomplished compared to the previous period, unquestionably. So yes, I mean, and to say that there is this kind of mythology that one can live in a world in which the government is kept to a minimum of national defense and contract enforcement, and that world, if it ever existed, fell apart by 1930 and has not been brought back in the advanced countries since, and cannot be. If they tried it, they would collapse again. So efforts to actually take the mythology seriously do an enormous damage. Nowhere more, I might say, than in Greece, where we are now, where the country was forced into a devastating austerity as a result of the crisis that broke in 2010, and from which its social institutions, I mean, they suffered enormously, and from which, so far as I'm aware, they haven't recovered.
Yeah, excellent point. I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, tell us who you are and which institution you are representing. Before I come to you, I want to ask Jomo one more question. We've heard how that international cooperation is obviously key here to tackle these issues. Do you see this happening, and what would be your, first order of business when it comes to international cooperation? You're tackling these issues. What is the most urgent thing to do?
Well, I think we are generally agreed that the state has a role, a redistributive role, in terms of fiscal policy, as you put it, in terms of both taxation as well as spending. So if you look at tax rates, we have seen a significant shift in the last 4 decades or so, with a decline in the rates of both corporate taxation as well as the progressivity of income taxation. And part of the problem, of course, is that you have international competition among countries which compete to offer more and more attractive sites to potential investors, etc. And this tax competition has actually made the impact of taxation far less progressive and arguably in many situations even regressive because of the greater significance of consumption taxes, however organized. Then you have a trend on the spending side as well. And on the spending side, I think there are a number of elements. But for example, if one was to provide for universal health coverage based on tax revenue, you could have some slightly better arrangements or significantly better arrangements when you compare the status quo, for example, in a country like the United States or other countries where you have an insurance system where the insurance system has a certain perversity which results in a great deal of unnecessary costs due to the organization of the actuarial system and the insurance system on the one hand, and then attempts to reduce what is called insurance fraud. So you have spending choices which can have very, very different outcomes. Now, as far as international cooperation is concerned, I think one of the big problems which many developing countries in particular face is the inability to raise capital, partly because of the policies which they have undertaken to open up their economies, expecting that somehow or other there would be a net flow of capital from abroad. What is often forgotten is that the flows of finance from abroad or portfolio capital has got nothing to do with investments in the real economy. So the economic capacities of these economies are not being advanced by any means through this kind of perverse behavior. And then you have an American system, as we heard from Professor Galbraith, where you have a certain degree of transparency, and then the rest of the world is struggling to unite itself around as the alternative. I think what may well be best in terms of organizing taxation, particularly corporate taxation, which is the biggest challenge which we have right now, is to have a transparent system and drawing certain features of the American system of taxation on the one hand, and then distributing that taxation and getting cooperation on this is going to be extremely difficult. I know that I tried to deal with the Assistant Treasury Secretary when I was working at the UN, who was the first one who was appointed when Obama came in. He was very keen until he was told that that was not his job. His job was not to cooperate internationally to lose tax revenue to other countries. So that was the end of that cooperation. The Europeans are mainly working through the OECD, and one important initiative of the current leader of the OECD on tax, Pascal Saramon, is this thing called BEPS, the Base Erosion Profit, what's the S for? Sharing or something like that. Yeah? Sorry? Yeah. So that's a very important, useful initiative. But the current European proposals do not want to share the tax. They only want to share the incremental element in it. And to me, that is simply unacceptable as a matter of principle. So I think what we need to do is to try to move this. And although the time I was working we failed, I think there is some movement in this regard. And so getting cooperation, particularly on corporate taxation, is going to be very challenging. Of course, there are a whole range of new issues posed by the digitization and so on, which make the challenge even greater. But I think we have finally seen, after a long hiatus, some progress. And there is a commission chaired by Jose Antonio Ocampo, which has done some useful work in this regard. If I may go back to the earlier point, I think if you look at what is called the factorial or functional distribution of income, there has been a clear shift over the recent period away from labor income to incomes for capital.
Yeah.
I would say that to call it, and a lot of that has to do with different types of rents and the ability of capital to more successfully capture rents. That's why Professor Galbraith's earlier book on the predatory state becomes very important, because we often, this mythology which he referred to is extremely important for us to recognize, because it plays a very important legitimizing role, but which obscures the other roles which the state unfortunately plays in modern society.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'm glad we have his Professor Galbraith's book mentioned here at this point. Great. So, to the audience, I think the lady at the end of the table had a question.
Good
Please go
afternoon,
ahead.
good afternoon, everyone. I'm Crystal Audison from South Africa, a journalist. The question to the panel is, we've seen a return of very, dire structural adjustment programs from the International Monetary Fund in different African countries, namely Angola and Mozambique. We also see the same happening in Latin America. What's your view on the return of the IMF and the World Bank, in particular to developing countries, and the dire impact it's leaving on the country's economies? Thank you.
Who wants to have a shot at this? Dr. Darush.
Yeah, I thought actually that you were going to ask a question about directly about inequality, because South Africa, of course, is now the country with by far the highest inequality in the world. But on the structural adjustment programs, what the big question always with respect to the structural adjustment is twofold. One, is there an alternative? What is the alternative to a structural adjustment program in Argentina if they cannot repay their debts? Is the alternative that the international community is just outright going to forgive those debts, or provide a whole bunch of money for the Argentines to redress the balance? Where's the money coming from? So the message is that when they get into this kind of situation, very typically there is no alternative. They need to adjust. The world is not going to pay for them beyond a certain point, although there is some subsidization implicit in these structural adjustment programs. And the second question which arises in these programs is, how do you do them in a way that minimizes the impact on the most vulnerable members of society? And my sense is that both the World Bank, and I retired from the World Bank 10 years ago, so I'm a little bit out of touch, but I still live in Washington, so it's kind of all around me. There's been a big change in the World Bank and the IMF's approach to their policies generally and to structural adjustment programs in particular since, I would say, the end of the 90s, when we had the big Asian financial crisis. And then in recent years, with the concerns about inequality. So you will read in the programs of the International Monetary Fund, not to mention the World Bank, which is dealing with long-term structural issues, you will read quite a lot of concern about, okay, so we're going to make these changes. There has to be a devaluation. There has to be some fiscal consolidation. How do we do this? How do we do the fiscal consolidation in a way that you protect the most vulnerable? And I think that's progress. But of course, it's not a panacea. At the end of the day, the country has to adjust.
Yes, I would quite agree that the bank and the fund have both changed, although I would say that not always for the better. I expressed some concern, for instance, about the initiative of the last president of the bank, President Kim, who was nominated by the Obama administration with his financialization initiative, which has huge implications. I mean, you're basically asking governments, financially strapped governments, to guarantee profits, to lower risk, to use the language. And that, to me, is very worrisome. But coming back to your specific question, I think we have a situation where one thing I've learned is that the fund is not a monolithic organization. And often it does things which it's not even entitled to do. For instance, the fund, Article 6 of the fund, guarantees every sovereign country the right to manage its capital account. But in effect, particularly during when MD Michel Kamdesu was MD, I mean, he was a very good Catholic, but he also believed very, very strongly in opening up the capital account, and he believed that it would result in very benign consequences for what were then politely called emerging market economies, referring not only to developing countries, but also to the so-called transition economies. That didn't materialize, and the consequences are among those which I referred to earlier. Now, what specifically is happening in many countries often depends on the officers responsible. Some officers share the concerns which you and I may have, and may well try to ensure that the adverse effects, the onerous effects, are minimized. But again, it requires an incredible amount of courage and persistence by the officers concerned to go against the grain of the fund. There are people, Mr. Agan here, for example, who left the bank because the bank would not do, would not be tight, more serious about fighting against corruption, and so on. So we have. It's very difficult to summarize too much, but I would share the concern that the fund is not necessarily a very benign organization, and the basic tendency is still to act in particular ways which are quite conventional and which are not far different from what we saw happening during the 1980s. Obviously, some lessons have been learned. They're not going to do the same kind of things. After all, as you know, there was not just one generation of structural adjustment, but 4 or 5 generations, depending on how you count. And so, and sometimes they're not even, structural adjustment doesn't even dare to call itself structural adjustment anymore. It packages itself rather differently as a PRSP or something else, So I think it's very important to be very specific about what is happening in particular countries, the degrees of policy freedom, which some governments may enjoy, while other governments may not enjoy that. But also at the level of the national policy, the degree of the willingness to buck with the trend. Slightly over 2 decades ago, when the Asian crisis happened, the Prime Minister of Malaysia rejected fund advice, took advice instead from others, including, among others, Joe Stiglitz, who was vice president of the bank at that time. But it was probably because it was Joe Stiglitz rather than because it was vice president of the bank. So and it's not very clear how all that worked out. So I think while I would readily agree that we have greater willingness to consider a variety of policy options, and there's greater awareness of the kinds of criticisms which civil society, particularly with the help of the media, might make. But at the same time, I think the basic default response is to do more of the same, and we know what that is. And the big problem, of course, is that in the last 2 decades, financial markets, financialization has actually proceeded further. It has not been checked. It was not checked by the crisis of 2008, 2009, and there have been very few other checks to that. And so I think we are far more vulnerable in developing countries, and I would suggest that we are far more vulnerable in the world economy as a whole as a consequence of all this. Thank you.
Let me come in on that, if I might. It seems to me that every country that entrusts its development strategy to international finance, international financial flows, is making a Faustian bargain. And it is not that the investors, having naively entrusted in the honesty and effectiveness of the country's institutions, suddenly discover that there's cronyism and corruption. It's that they generally get nervous about the fate of their funds outside their home countries and flee en masse, not from one country, but from the developing world and emerging markets as a whole. And then the IMF is called in, and structural adjustment is not there, cannot be designed to protect the least vulnerable in any effective way, because its entire purpose is to restrict the resources that are available to support the broader and the most vulnerable population. That's what structural adjustment is. Its purpose is to cut imports and to get the financial flows back to the point where they're not dependent on the international flows that were there previously. That's the entire function of the system. And so it seems to me that in a line with what's sometimes called the new developmentalism of my friend Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira, and I'm sorry, it may be echoing, but I like to get the sound to carry. One has to recognize that the development is a long-term process, and it has to be stable over a long period of time. And this is incompatible with being reliant on the alternating sequence of capital inflow and structural adjustment. It simply doesn't work. And countries which have avoided that have had a much more successful trajectory over decades, of which the world's leading example is clearly the People's Republic of China, but there are others. And I'll say, as a matter of personal pride, that when I had a role as an advisor in China in 1995, one thing I did was to organize a conference at which I brought in some very distinguished economists, Robert Eisner in particular, on the explicit commitment that he would urge them not to liberalize the capital account, which they didn't do. And you know, when we wrapped up that particular project in 1997, I got a very brief shish yeah for having offered that advice a couple of years previously. So it's really a question, and it's a question that affects the countries that you describe, who have this long history of being at the end of a yo-yo of inflows and outflows. And the outflows are inevitably extremely painful because they are there to try and reestablish another period of inflows later on. And then, you know, you're just getting into the same thing once again. So I do believe that there is a necessity for an entirely different model, which is capable of playing out over decades of steady institutional strengthening. That's not a model that is made compatible with the required rate of return of global financiers.
All right, are there any other questions? The gentleman over here. Yeah, just hit the button.
Just press the button.
Okay.
My name is Tatsuko Tegawa. I'm now the research director at the Canon Institute, but formerly I was the representative for Japan at the IMF, and also I was the deputy chairman of the Committee on Fiscal Affairs in charge of international tax at OECD. And my question, I think, ultimately goes to Professor Galbraith. But I'd like to first, explain the background. In early 1990s, Dutch government tried to raise the corporate tax rate, but Philips and Unilever and Royal Dutch Shell opposed. They threatened the Dutch government to move, by saying that they would like to move to London, their headquarters. Because of that, Dutch government actually gave up those kind of raising tax. With that background, in 1996, I inserted a special wording in the Lyon Summit communique and proposed to establish the committee named Tax Competition. The aim was to attack those countries who actually provide very low tax rates, such as Cayman and Bahama and Singapore. And after 1 year, we reached the agreement. And those days, it was the democratic government in the United States. So my counterpart in their government, such as Mr. Leslie Samuels, they were fully cooperated with us. So late 1990s, only for 3 years, this worked very well. So those countries I just mentioned, they had to change their system. But when George Bush came in, Republicans didn't care about those kinds of loopholes. So when Obama came in, I had hoped that they would actually return to the 1990s notion of those kind of a thing, tax system with equality, but that didn't happen. So my question is, what is Professor Galbraith's view? Why Obama government didn't actually take into account those kind of things? Thank you.
Well, I wasn't there in the internal discussions of the Obama administration, but in general, it was continuous with the Bush administration with respect to important personnel, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the Secretary of the Treasury, as well as in defense policy, Secretary Gates, who just stayed in his job. And so the changes that were brought to bear dealt with the immediate emergency of the financial crisis, basically, the stimulus package. And then they were done with it. They did with healthcare, but they had no larger ambitions, and certainly were unfortunately not about to try to restore the status quo of the prior political situation in the United States that had prevailed between the Democratic and the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. And I think that's, well, it shows that the effect of the transition to a much more neoliberal ideology in the United States had pervaded by that point both parties, and there was not a strong dissenting voice to it until the emergence in 2016 of Senator Sanders. And now there is. Now there's really clearly, and there's a certain tendency in American politics for countervailing forces to emerge, but the extreme ideological dedication of the mainstream to the principle of essentially deregulated capitalism has created a vast movement in the country which is opposed to that, which wasn't there before. It's a very interesting development.
All right, thank you very much. We're running out of time, unfortunately, but not before having heard our friend Vladimir Popov. Vladimir, you're with the Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute, of course. What is your conclusion? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. I don't want to be in your shoes now, but what are the main takeaways here?
Well, we certainly can agree that this is a difficult task, to summarize what is happening in the world economy and to point out to the trends, where the world economy is growing. It is difficult because we see contradictory trends, and when I ask myself, honestly, where the world economy is going, I should say that we don't really know, or at least I don't really know, what particular trends will take the upper hand. On the one hand, we have the longest upturn in history of the world economy. We have statistics for 200 years, recent 200 years. Economic booms did not last more than 4 or 5 years, at most 7 years, like in 1960s, 7-something years in 1960s. Every 4 or 5 years or every 2 or 3 years, we have a downturn. Now, we didn't have a downturn since 2008, 2009 recession, the Great Recession. And the world economy continues to grow, and we're asking a question why we don't have a downturn. Is something changes in the mechanism of the world economy and in the mechanism of functioning of the major countries, like the United States. We have the lowest unemployment in 50 years, 3.5% in the United States. We have the highest living standards ever. The world today enjoys, on average, some people are better off, some people are worse off, but on average, we have the highest living standards ever. We have also the lowest number of people that are lost, the lowest number of casualties, lives that are lost in conflicts, ethnic conflicts, conflicts between countries, terrorist attacks, and so on. The number as a proportion of total population is the lowest. So our life is as good as it never was, and still we are very worried. Why we are worried? Because we see some trends that can undermine the current prosperity. And the current prosperity, the current liberal order, which is so much praised, looks very shaky if we look at these trends. One of the trends is growing income inequalities. And with the growing income inequalities, you know, I come from the country, Russia, the Soviet Union, and I remember the slogans in the Soviet Union. One of the slogans said, "Fight for technical progress." We made jokes out of it. Where do we go to fight? Who is against it, right? The same can be said about income inequalities. Did you see one single person who is trying to increase income inequalities? No, you ask academics, you ask media people, you ask people at this conference, you ask politicians. Everyone talks about the danger of rising income inequalities. What do we see in reality? We see that they continue to rise. Everyone talks about it, but the inequalities continue to rise, even more so. The tax system that was pointed out by Joma, by James Galbraith, by Uri Dadush, everyone knows the tax system becomes less progressive. In 1960s, taxes, personal income taxes, were much more progressive than they are today. So we have rising inequalities, and taxes that are supposed to take care to redistribute are going down. So if everyone talks about it and nothing is being done, the conclusion is that the elite doesn't feel the danger. The elite feels very complacent. They think that by talking about it, they can take care of the problem of some parts of the society that are not gaining from globalization, and they can delay the issue. They're not serious about doing something. They don't feel there's going to be a revolution. They don't feel there's going to be a collapse of the world trend. We can point out to other trends. You know, income inequality is only one story. The other story is, of course, climate change, right? Everyone talks about it, and nothing is being done. Well, except for China, maybe Europe and China are the exceptions in this case because they are doing something. We can point out to the financialization of the economy. The financial sector is growing, growing, growing. We thought that after the recession, after the global recession, we'll take care of it and will limit somehow the financial sector. No, the ratio of debts to GDP today, total debts to total GDP in the world, 150%. What was it in the 1960s? 50% only. And, you know, it's not enough to say that we need this financialization for economic development. Most likely it's a bubble. We have to deal with a bubble. But so far, we were not able to deal with a bubble. Now, there are other trends, of course, like the sanctions and trade embargoes and Brexits and economic nationalism in the world. This economic nationalism can lead to the disruption of the world trade. I have the chart here. This is export to GDP ratio since the beginning of the 19th century. The first year here is 1827. In 1827, it was only 5% export to GDP in the world, only 5%. It was growing, growing, growing. It reached a maximum of, say, 13% before the First World War. This was the era of the first globalization. In the first globalization, the world was, you know, the life was good. Before the First World War, life was very good. Those people who remember it, they left some reminiscences saying that life was good at that time, and economists also enjoyed the era of globalization, free movement of goods and free movement of capital. Then, after the Great Depression of 1930s, it went down. In between the two world wars, the ratio of export to GDP, the international trade, collapsed and went down to 5%. And it is only in 1970s and 1980s that the level of globalization that was reached before the First World War was exceeded. After that, it increased considerably, but now it is kind of stumbling. And this is the reminder that, you know, things can happen very quickly. That if there are trade sanctions and embargoes, the world trade, we think it cannot be the case, that liberal world order is forever, but, you know, it can collapse. The world trade can collapse, and we can go back to the era which was something like in between the two wars. So what is the conclusion? What kind of conclusion I can make if it seems like it is difficult to put together these contradictory trends? We probably have to, not only to talk more about it, we have to take the dangers more seriously. And there should be more research and more discussion of the dangers. We cannot take it for granted that things will continue as they are, even though today the world is at a better shape than it ever was. They say nothing blinds as much as success. So we have to avoid this this mistake of the past. If history is any judge, and if history teaches us something, we have to be able to forecast the future trends. It's better to overstate the dangers than to understate them. Otherwise, the current mood of the elite that we're heading to the brave new world and all the problems can be taken care of, well, this complacency can prove to be very dangerous. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Vladimir, for a great conclusion. I like the fact that, you know, we tell people not to do PowerPoint presentations, and then they come up with their own sheets of paper here with their graphics. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you, James Galbraith, Uri Dadush, and Jomo Sundaram, and of course, Vladimir Popov for your contributions. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.